So we laughed and added a name of my then I hey, thanks for having me. Thanks. You kidding me? Okay, yeah, I made it. I'm glad to be here.
You know where it is?
Lots of things here.
You coming from home or work?
What?
You coming from home?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. All right.
Give yourself 2 hours. Just check back on Tuesday. I gave you. Well, yeah, I stopped in. I got a prescription. It's 2 hours. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I need to hold my crap up here.
Is that your jacket over there?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Hmm. Ah. Yeah.
I knew Laura told me
Right, yeah.
he's out in Southern California.
He's okay. He's kind of coming out of it. He's real. He's very child supplying right now. So yeah, I know.
Everybody's good. Lorenzo's graduating. She wins, starting to get ready for college.
Oh my.
So Lorenzo's gonna do this sort of transition program at the school, and then after 2 years. And he'll be ready to start, maybe with college, ready for residential programs and stuff. So, so we got 2 more years and then they'll both we'll be empty nesters.
That's great to be around. Say back to life. Not having to do that.
Yeah, no, it's time for everything to get out. Yeah.
All right.
No, I didn't know. It's a couple of months ago that she enjoyed it.
She's lovely. We have a house now.
Hey. When's the last time I saw you?
See the movie? Did you put this?
Still.
She got like a little.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
I
Man.
don't make
Like really nice.
You're like, no, maybe not.
It's like
If I post India, you see that for India?
Yeah. Did you?
Well, maybe I'll-
So that I didn't see.
Well, it's December. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Not to Brown, but to,
Yeah, and there's a Cali. For,
yeah.
and it's done since Pat tells you.
It's for,
It's a crazy times coming. We're now in Yale for the first week of, and we're going to Portugal for a week. All the teacher.
yeah. So
Be insane.
be there for one day, then the next day,
You can say that
I'm
now.
going to have lunch with,
No,
basically have my own private boycott
I
Brown ever since
Stuff
they
that I
didn't give
use, but
Renee
I felt
Gladney
everything
to-
didn't work.
Yes.
I like
Years
it.
ago.
We said, well, we don't decide to move.
And now they seem to be
Yeah.
really up to some shit.
Did we
They're not
get
told.
behind?
No, no, it's,
They must be.
So,
they don't
okay,
know.
Yeah.
but I'm supposed to meet
Yeah.
some people for
So,
breakfast. So
you know, I have to say it.
so I'll let y'all know, maybe y'all can help them.
Yeah, tomorrow's doing.
I don't- The real question is whether, well, we'll talk about it.
Yeah, all right. No, but you have a good thing. I have a thing on the horizon. It's a bird in hand.
Yeah.
Now you.
All right.
Yeah, I'm teaching
Did you read that shit?
this fall, but this spring, but then next year we'll get that one.
But did you read that? You turn it.
Yes,
Book
they-
into
they-
a word.
I don't
The
know.
least important.
It's really,
I told you from the
I mean,
beginning, right? Did I was like, you've seen that, done anything?
So
Like
far.
smiley. Yeah, so far. Here's
Oh,
the
I'm so
wager.
excited.
I had time off.
1,000% wager.
And,
He's gonna be next.
you know, when we were moving.
He's gonna try it.
But this is the first time where.
His chest move is
I'm
right
right up towards him.
kind of.
That
So I'm up to him to make me.
Yeah.
1,000%.
The silver was gone.
Insecurity exploding off of him, right? What was that? That's not, you don't invite someone to your house,
Yes.
right?
That was all.
It just.
Kind of down. Oh, shit.
Yeah.
That's it. It was just like, so hard to say, we weren't even doing it. Didn't come up with that. It's like, well, this was done 3 years ago. You know how books go. And it doesn't even matter, you know? This is not how I use it. It's like, well,
Yeah.
yes, and you missed, you have 3,000
Yes,
words where you actually didn't spend one sentence.
Get asked, I wish I, maybe you did.
All right.
Oh, sorry, what?
Do it.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Which is, but it's always like this every time for 5 years.
I'm gonna,
Yes,
okay.
Swirsky. Came all the way out here from Jackson Heights. That's a fucking soul.
Mostly got it.
I was with you.
That's center.
I wasn't at the Betsy. I came
That
from
was,
him.
no. I
Oh,
see that.
oh, yes, she was. Of course she was. Of course she was. With one of the daughters. And would have been with two if she was in Mexico.
Oh, okay. Nice.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, I'm good. I'm sorry. I can take care of myself.
I mean, it's.
I got like 5 emails from people saying, "What the fuck? Wow, so wow." Are you kidding me? Come on. Come. What's the point? What's the point? We could have had such a good day.
Yeah, no, afterwards I went back and read some of the other ones. I said.
If they're not like that, yeah, usually it's ass kissing. But I'm afraid. You can't. Yeah, yeah, but it's really, there's no history. It's only been like 4 meetings over 4 years and everyone has gone the same way. This is like wax smile and this static of like anxiety and insecurity. Yes. Sir, we have no setting like this. I love this space. I've been here so many times. It's actually not a little space too.
It truly
It
is.
is. It's too back and it's so, yeah, yeah, this is a swept up, but I've had so many good,
Yeah.
both on this side of the table and that side of the table. I mean, so many. I mean, you have, because this is your home, but this is not my home. Yeah, what?
They don't know. I mean, some people
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. I'll be there in a few weeks
Oh, yeah,
at
so
the African
if it's all-
Studies.
To be, you'll be at home.
No, none of all of these people like. When I was and won't let me do a book there. It's like I'm killing myself to do new stuff. I'm writing a Jane one right now. I'm like up all night and trying to keep this straight and write the sealer.
Yeah.
Sealer Jane.
Like, what is the directive? Like, you want me to come and talk about?
It's like freaking these things. I was like, can I just talk about Caribbeans? You know, I was like, man, I threw a little inclusion in the film.
Yep.
A James Day, doing like Lennon, James, and Crewman.
Okay.
James is a genius of like thinking, Lennon, thinking, Williams, throwing, thinking.
Are you gonna do the both lectures are gonna be this talk?
I'm just, I got an 80-page paper. I'm trying to get down to 20 pages and I got like 5 days. It is, but I'm like,
Great problem. It's a chapter?
it's not even,
What is that?
it's, I started writing for this thing and then it's, I now have 3 James papers, but none of them are chapters. It's interesting. They're definitely, I'm working on the book, but they don't fall into the chapters I've imagined for the book,
Will you reimagine the book based on what you've been writing?
I don't know. There's no
Yeah.
question. I think this, as always. Hey. It's so long.
Maybe.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Manuel's great. No, she's in Paris.
I was gonna say.
No, he's in Paris.
Yeah. Oh my God, what a sweetheart. I didn't even, I'm gonna have to take notes on you guys. So did you, I don't want to put you on the spot in case you didn't, because I don't give a shit, but I didn't. Did you read my little Ellison bit? Did you read the Ellison anthology?
I read the whole thing.
Read the whole thing? It's
It's a
okay,
great
it's a
chapter.
big book, you don't have to read the whole thing. I don't have to read the whole thing.
That's great.
Whoops, whoops. You're twisted. That's for after.
Guys.
You just in you were just in Joburg.
I wasn't.
Hear about that. I want to hear about that. But anyway,
Yeah. and the little stuff.
those two, we'll talk after, even if they don't come up, but we saw and the ontology chapters for you, though. Not for you, but like that's deep. You're I'm in a reading
You'll
group.
hear from me tonight, but like, what, I came into this book looking for help on the master project, frankly.
Did you get any?
Yeah, and I
I
want.
love
like,
it.
that's what-
Yes. Oh,
concerning
good.
Or my question comments, I guess, are about.
Good. I would, especially since I've been thinking more about that, especially since I'm doing it. So the challenges are totally.
It was, you guys, this conversation around the video.
Yes.
Maybe want to push in another direction, like pull a little thread in the books.
I like
Hear what
it.
you have to say.
Can't wait. But yeah, I've been thinking about that single person project.
Hmm.
The problem, just I don't have any ambition that I'm capable of writing to a general audience. Which is okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I
mean,
told
like
you, I
it's
have a
different,
different,
though.
I have a different ambition for the
know.
next one. The
I know.
comrades, yeah, the
Yeah.
comrades, like the
I was gonna
comrades
say
have to be
something
on this. The comrades have to be around.
Yeah.
But they're like, dreamy, reedy,
Mhm.
I don't have, it's neither the. Look at that. Vacation. Yes. There's lots of that. Yes. I like that guy. He's a nice guy. I like
Have
him.
you known him?
Events. One event really, I don't know you, where we both presented and heard each other's stuff and had a couple of them.
Got it.
Didn't keep in touch. And then he was here at the Valley Bar lecture, so I said hi to him and it was that crazy. I think he spoke and then she was saying. What is that whole thing? Yeah, that was it. That was it.
Very weird moment.
So it's
Very
right after.
weird.
She said, how is this a bad idea? And she tried to. Didn't do that was much harder for her. No idea. You asked, you're asking about a 15-year-old.
Set the stage for you.
One of my students, Nikhil, beautiful. Yeah, he's competing with like that's what title 15-year-old. 13, 14. Valentina, I remember I told you about Valentina. This is Valentina. This is Valentina.
I recall all. It's weird, but it's self-delusion.
She's got a book. She's been in here for we've been doing it. Okay. You know, we're like, it's we're close. Is it true? I'm not yeah, because we have the Paris mountain. She knows that. It's so good. It's good. She just has just had a job. She's been in Italy. She's been just precarious with the edge of Navy, getting a position after postdoc, and then the fascists removed that whole position. And then last week she was like, I have to go into a job today. And I have a job. It's been promised to someone else. We all know that. My professor told me they know that, but they are going through wasting my fucking time. But it's the kind of thing where
White hair.
I'll never get the job, but if I fuck up, I'll never get any jobs. And I have to wake up at 4 in the morning to do it. And so, and then she called me that night, or saw me that night. It was the day of my thing last week. She said, I got the job. That was this boy, and it was
Here?
impossible to get. It's like she's telling, but she did her joint degree in France, in Paris.
Oh, Nadia. Where is Nadia? I'm like, wait,
Yeah, not full.
she's class until 6.
So you haven't been out since Thanksgiving? Is that possible? Not enough.
Visit the doctor, that's about it.
Oh, no. What a nice.
Couple things, only. And the first time I went to the doctor, I went to a poetry reading that, which I shouldn't have done. And then the second time I went to the doctor, my son was gonna play, so I went to see his play. But
You know, those are two, if you're gonna do it, like theater and poetry and parenting and, you know, joy.
yeah,
Was it your poetry you were presenting? Or were you listening?
there was a famous venue back in the days of the bar scene of downtown called Studio Ridley. And they have a series of concerts and stuff there over 1 week, mile or two, sort of commemorate. And you wanted to go to all of the things, but I had to do something else.
Yeah, no.
And I probably should have done it, but I was.
Sometimes you gotta take care of yourself, and then choosing life is also taking care of yourself.
Yeah, but it was. I guess it was worth it, but I kept trying to get up.
You paid a price.
Before I was ready, but I feel like I'm finally. I realize now. I think that this is really intense information, but I had COVID over Christmas, and I think that's what.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Oh, my God.
Oh, you
What
made
play
it
was your son in?
today. I think
Romeo and Juliet.
Oh.
we got your next friend.
See Christmas before COVID.
Oh, wait, really? Which?
Yes,
That's weird. Lamps.
I know. I referred to you as, I just told Cam I haven't seen you since we see the book, and I referred to you as the closest of my friends I haven't seen since before COVID. There are people I haven't seen, but I'm not really, yes.
You would have expected to.
It's okay. But it's fine. It's fine. It's good. Here, we got a dump over there. And then it's always the tricky, like getting hot. Want to take this off? No, don't take this off. Okay.
Yeah, you
Get
can.
a rain, messing.
I should've got it.
Like,
Gary, these are.
no, they're not problems. They're not problems at all. A rainy Tuesday night.
It's pretty impressive. Oh, we even ran on Tuesday night.
And there's an online thing too, I think.
What's that?
I think there's an online thing.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Wilder again.
Oh, I need my glasses, but you can start.
He's in Dallas. I'm in Dallas.
What else? Oh.
They're my students. That's certainly not. One student who's like.
Your good friend Bruce Woody is one of my best friends.
And I want to be there. It's like, you don't have to be there. You don't have to be there. And then she went the next day. She's like, it's too many bad boys from Colombia. I can't do it. I was like, I never expected you to be there. But I wanted to be this.
That's quite a great
Yes.
feeling about it.
What do you think? The radio is?
Yeah.
All right. All right, I think we'll get started. Thanks all. Thank you for all coming out. Welcome to Utopia 713. Welcome everyone here. Welcome to Nadia Abu El Haj. Welcome to Kayama Glover. Welcome to Fred Moten. And of course, welcome to Gary Wilder. This year at Utopia 1313, we are studying concrete utopias. We're trying to lay both a critical foundation, which was where we started the first semester with Etienne Balibar, the second semester with Noam Chomsky. We're also exploring material instantiations of concrete utopias, from Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, to union organizing right here at Columbia University, passing through worker cooperatives, eco-farming cooperative, solidarity economics, and cooperation writ large. Tonight, we focus our seminar on another critical theoretic intervention, a new, rich, and deeply engaging book, Concrete Utopianism, The Politics of Temporality and Solidarity, by Gary Wilder, just published by Fordham University Press in 2022. In the book, Gary Wilder advocates for a turn away from certain strands of contemporary critical thought. Perhaps I was lumping them together as kind of forms of negative dialectics and pessimism, Afro-pessimism, certain cultural strands of post-colonial thought, and for a turn, or rather a return, to more, we could say, constructive political forms of critical and practical engagement. Gary Wilder, one of the leading critics and historians of Francophone Black Atlantic social thought, draws in large part on those traditions to counterpose to critical skeptics a path towards a more positive, engaged political stance. Gary Wilder's concrete utopian vision might be called, using his words, a possible, his and others, possible impossible internationalism. Wilder's book forms part of a contemporary rebirth of new forms of utopianism that can be sometimes called concrete utopias, at least by Gary Wilder, Etienne Balibar, earlier Ernst Bloch, and in this seminar itself, sometimes called real utopias from a slightly different perspective. Eric Olin Wright's book, Envisioning Real Utopias, also thought sometimes of through the French term Utopia, which we'll be working on with Laïcia Ries in Paris for Utopia 1113. The exact terms, of course, have implications, but the overall arching thrust of this, we might call it a movement, is to revive within critical theory a turn to praxis. Our distinguished colleague at Columbia, Kayama Glover, has curated this seminar and brought us all together here, all of you, Utopia 13, to converse with Fred Moten, Nadia Abu El Haj, and Gary Wilder to think critically about concrete utopianism. So I want to thank you, Kayama. I also want to give a special thanks to the Heyman Center and Eileen Galuli, who we're working with, and of course, a big shout out to Fonda Shen from the center for making all of this happen. Thank you. So let me introduce our guests I'll go in alphabet. We're going to be a little bit going out of that order. But let me start with Professor Nadia Abu El-Haj, who is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor in Anthropology here at Columbia University, co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies. She's the author of several books, numerous journal articles published on topics ranging from the history of archaeology in Palestine to the question of race and genomics today. Her books include Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society, and The Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins and the Politics of Epistemology. Kayama Glover is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of French and Africana Studies here at Columbia University, Faculty Director of the Barnard Digital Humanities Center. Her teaching and research interests include Francophone literature, particularly that of Haiti and the French Antilles, colonialism and post-colonialism, and sub-Saharan Francophone African cinema. She's the author most recently of A Regarded Self, Caribbean Womanhood and the Ethics of Disorderly Being, and Haiti Unbound, a spiralist challenge to the post-colonial canon. Fred Moten is one of our most brilliant poets today, cultural theorist whose work explores critical theory, Black studies, and performance studies. Fred Moten is the author, as you know, all with Stefano Harney of The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, and All Incomplete. We had the privilege of reading and discussing The Undercommons as part of Praxis 1313. It was a remarkable session with Jack Halberstam, who's here with us, and Mark Hebay, Heather Love, and Allegra McLeod. It was inspiring. I always come back to this passage from The Undercommons, right? In our abolitionist world, I think we all do this passage where they write on page 42, what is, so to speak, the object of abolition? Not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that would have prisons, that could have slavery, that could have the wage, and therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society. Hopefully we'll be able to engage that since abolition is on the table in Gary Wilder's book. Professor Moten is also the author of numerous other books and volumes of essays and poetry, including In the Break, Houston's Tavern, B. Jenkins, The Field Trio, The Little Edges, The Service Porch, and many more. Professor in the Department of Performance Studies at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. So I want to welcome all of you to this panel, and all of you as well. And Gary Wilder, of course, who I introduced a little bit earlier, but come back to now. I redid everything. There we go. Thank you. Of course. Gary Wilder is professor of anthropology with cross appointments in history and French at the Graduate Center at CUNY, where he's also the director of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. Gary's work on the French Empire, Francophone West Africa and the Caribbean, and Black Atlantic social thought is located at the intersection of historical anthropology, intellectual history, and critical theory. He's the author of Freedom Time, Négritude, Decolonization and the Future of the World, and the French Imperial Nation State, Négritude and Colonial Humanism Between the World Wars. And of course, his newest book, Concrete Utopianism, is what we'll be discussing tonight. So I wanted to thank you all, and I want to thank you for coming. And I also want to thank all of our colleagues and friends who are in the audience with us for a great conversation. Jack, thanks for coming. Kendall Thomas, Emmanuel Sada, I see Jay Gossett, Omavi Shakur, Eileen Galuli, thanks for joining us, Reinhold Martin as well. So everyone's here, and I'm going to turn it over first then to Kayama Glover. Welcome and thanks.
So if you're not fed up with thanks, let me just say again, thank you so much, Bernard, for creating this space for us to have this conversation. Of course, thank you, Gary, for bringing this book into our world and giving us this opportunity to think about the rich provocative and fascinating ideas you bring up here. I'm looking forward to this conversation from very different perspectives on something so urgent, which will be a keyword in the remarks I'll be making today, in addition to the word love. So I curated this panel, and I meant to sort of fade into the background, but I did want to get my 2 cents in before ceding the floor to my colleagues. So I'll get started. I took to heart your suggestion to be conversational, because we have a lot of conversations. I'm going to continue in that vein. Can everyone hear me when I turn away from the mic? It's all, you cannot, you see? So thank you, Eileen. So I'm going to be like this. Is this good? All right. So knowing you, Gary, as a friend, as a scholar, as someone who thinks, writes, teaches, and very much lives the political concepts that worry you in all of your work, and I use worry very pointedly, not in the sense that we're so comfortable with preoccupy me in my work, but actually in a very affective way that worry you in the ways that are visceral and material, this urgency that animates all of your work, and this book in particular. So knowing you as this kind of a scholar worried about the world that you study, I want to take as a point of departure the idea that every bit of the rich theoretical analysis and close reading that you do in this book, all of the trouble you take to establish a more expansive and entangled genealogy of leftist critical thought, you do all of this in service, in offering to. I read your book as issuing a series of reminders, of tools that we've maybe dropped too carelessly, dropped and forgotten, even maybe forgotten how to pick up, forgotten to pick up. With this book, you mean for us to read, to reread, to reflect, to imagine, and to do. You're shaking us. I have this image of you sort of shaking us by the shoulders as you're writing this, I guess typing and shaking at the same time, asking us, and the us I'm referring to are kinds of folks that are in this room, right? Self-styled progressive academics and scholars and thinkers. You're asking us to snap out of it, to think differently, to be more bold, and to return to things, as I said, that we may have left behind. And there's this sort of undertone or vibe in the book, as if you can't even believe that we haven't done that yet, that we're still operating in a sort of funk, as it were. And so I wanted to start by saying all of this, just to be clear about how I read this book, by which I mean allowing its insights to kind of land as so many embers, urging me urgently to be sparked into thinking more imaginatively or imagine more actively. So taking very seriously your repeated and sustained attention to immanence, to imminent critique, which I take to mean you're pushing at the borders and the conventions and the habits of the given in the now, and your exhortation to collapse and enrich and stop time, so to explore its alternatives. And one of those alternatives, among many, one that particularly intrigued me because of my current work, which considers, and for anyone who's heard me recently, especially talk about this work, that's kind of fraught work that considers a utopian thinking of the Cold War Haitian militant socialist novelist and erotic poet, René de Pestre. One of the alternatives or tools or embers that came out of this book is, as I mentioned earlier, love. And love, sure, humanist and fraternal, and yes, we love one another, but also and equally love as a sensual and even sexual phenomenon. The erotic, obviously, is what I'm talking about, is a radical proposition on the order of the profane illuminations that you point to in the book, identified by Benjamin, as an interruption of the everyday, as a perhaps surprising, generative, certainly, interruption of the everyday, an awakening, another term you refer to in the book, a making of the familiar or the taken for granted into something strange and inspiring. Awakening is a necessary part then of our critical project and our objectives. And so, sure, let's go towards throughout the book, I'd say, and then culminating in this kind of, or crystallizing in this moment toward the end, for those who brought your books along, 270 to 271, where you evoke Cornel West and Achille Mbembe and their insistence on the, quote, revolutionary power of love. Again, fine, we've heard this before, but the idea, right, of love is a de facto grounds for a future-oriented politics. I'm interested in this moment where you turn from West and Mbembe toward Audre Lorde, toward her important ruminations, in fact, on conflict and tension within communities of solidarity, which is something that runs throughout your book, and notably to her essay, Eye to Eye, Black Women, Hatred and Anger. And so what struck me about that moment is that you, and this is where I'm hoping you're going to help me with my book, and also we can maybe chat about this if you're interested, that you didn't turn to the uses of the erotic, right? Her essay from 1978, which is a response to second wave feminists and the question of pornography as either degrading of or empowering of women. But in this essay, her insistence on, quote, desire as a creative force for revolutionary change. So I went back to that essay for the umpteenth time, and I remembered just how gendered it is. That is, I thought more about how love, the quote unquote revolutionary power of love, has been taken seriously or not taken as seriously as a political position by, for, or available to men. And that struck me in a book that is, so for reasons that are obvious, the interlocutors, the folks that you're thinking about are overwhelmingly men. And so I thought that Lord's provocations in the uses of the erotic are especially significant to the kind of thinking that your work engenders, in as much that, as in this essay, the uses of the erotic, she moves from sexual desire to the poetic and the political, to the poetic as political. You know, she has that great question, what do you mean, a poetic revolutionary, a meditating gun runner? Right? She's asking us to think about the power of the erotic as embedded in intimacy and sharing, which are actually, you know, obviously necessary for solidarity and for the practice of politics, and has this quote, quoting her, sharing deeply any pursuit with another person. So she's talking about sex. Forms a bridge between two people and lessens the threat of their difference, like dancing, building a bookcase, writing a poem, examining an idea, end quote. So this seamless movement that Lord does from the interpersonal and the relational to the material and to the philosophical, all of this seems to me to accord with the keening toward world oneness from a space of idiosyncrasy, singularity, and locality that your work proposes. So a space, it reminds us that is immanently possible. And voila, I don't know if you're up to talking about sex as it relates to Utopia at all, and in the materiality of Utopia this evening. And we can certainly render this idea of the erotic less sexy if we use terms like conviviality or entanglement or whatever else, but in the spirit of ever so slight disruption that your book encourages us to notice and inhabit. And given that, from what I've seen of the seminars, the Utopia seminars thus far, the one sort of solid evocation of love was about the pathologies attached to the ways in which capitalism monetizes love or monetizes love for work, let's say. I think there's maybe Utopia 413, or I don't know, I was looking back at those. I just wanted to leave that door ajar to hear your thoughts on how and why men seem to have overlooked the erotic as a solid or a concrete project of utopian world building. And are we destined to keep doing so? Do any concrete utopian projects based in the erotic have political purchase or possibility today? And I'll leave it there.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kayama, for opening up that way. And I think we'll go next to Nadia and then Fred Moten.
Hi, first of all, apologies for. Thank you, Eileen. Apologies for being late. I was in a classroom. So I want to thank also Bernard and Kayama for organizing this and for including me, although I hope I hope, maybe I don't hope, but I'm feeling definitely like sort of outside this wheelhouse much more than the other people here, so you might have to bear with me. Okay. Concrete Utopianism is an ambitious and deeply erudite book, one that thinks through the work of a variety of prominent intellectuals and theorists in order to provide a framework for a different modality, of politics and thinking. Most centrally, it calls upon us, that is, those on the left, to move away from the work of negative critique and towards a project of thinking a radical otherwise. More than just making an argument in favor of the importance of tuning our analytic and political focus to the possible impossible, that is, to what possibilities lurk within or can be imagined in excess of our present, I think the book enacts that very political project. Yes, it reads in a critical mode, but then it moves to find possible impossibilities buried within and born of decidedly violent histories. Quite specifically, the histories of the Middle Passage, slavery, and the plantation economy. In that history and in the political theorizing, or the poetics of reason, born of it, there is a grounding here for thinking outside existing horizons of the taken for granted. The problem of culturalism and identitarianism as theory and or as politics is one object of Gary's critique. It is one horizon of the taken for granted that we need to reject in the here and now. If we are to imagine an otherwise, in short, if we're going to create a more livable and survivable world, some genre of an older Marxist commitment to internationalism is for Gary essential. And what's more, contrary to what the realists, the culturalists, and the melancholics, and if you read the book, we move through it, and I have to admit, I fall into the category of the melancholic, although I'm not really sure I embrace it the way some of these people, like as a principle. So contrary to them, or what they may believe, creating a more livable world is not just essential, it is also possible. So central to Gary's own imaginative project is the thinking of major Black intellectuals, and more specifically, key figures whose historical location and thought is born of the Atlantic slave trade. More specific yet, the Caribbean and Edouard Glissant are central here. But before discussing, however, briefly the place of the history of the Atlantic slave trade as a way of thinking the possible impossible, I'm going to take a detour into Gary's critique of what he calls left culturalism. Maybe overdetermined as the anthropologist on the panel. So I quote, "One way to begin thinking about organizing convergence while respecting diversity is through a practice of translation." These are Gary's words. "It makes the familiar strange and the strange familiar." And I have to say, that's an oddly classic anthropological project for you, Gary. I continue the quote. "The task is to do so in ways that emphasize both the irreducible gap and possible relation between strangeness and familiarity. But," Gary continues, "this potential affinity between translation practices and solidarity politics is foreclosed by currents of left culturalism, whose important attention to cultural singularity often leads to quasi-ontological insistence on categorically incommensurable forms of life," unquote. So let me begin by emphasizing the beginning of the quotation, which was actually a quote, but I don't know from what. "Organizing convergence while respecting diversity." In other words, whatever this new internationalism is going to look like, it isn't in the name of some homogenizing or universal politics or future. So what is the problem with such frameworks? Gary argues, the political limitation, for example, of Afro-pessimist thought is, quote, "that its insistence on ontological incommensurability implies a presentist assumption that current conditions are unsurpassable," unquote. This ontological orientation, he then goes on to say, is characteristic of a culturalism, although in less acute form perhaps, that also, quote, "runs through some recent currents of post-colonial thinking," unquote. Such accounts, he explains, efface internal heterogeneity and contradictions, that is, within cultures, and or they posit incommensurabilities among them, and more specifically between the West and non-Western life worlds. Let me quote again. "I would argue that the tendency to address the problem of translation by making ontological claims about language, cultures, and life worlds is analytically dubious and politically limiting. The critical challenge is to insist on entanglement and attend to impurity while respecting, even producing, singularities," unquote. It is precisely the question of entanglement as a foundational condition, as perhaps what one might call, following Ian Hacking's notion of historical ontology, a historical ontological condition, that makes the Black Atlantic so rich, the Black Atlantic thought so rich for Gary to think with. Enter Edouard Glissant and his quote unquote poetics of relations. I quote from Gary's book. "Glissant characterizes relations as an open totality wherein the whole is not the finality of its parts. For multiplicity in totality is total diversity. Closed or self-referential totalities are founded upon root identity that grounds the myths of pure origins and continuous lineages. Root identities also authorize the colonial expropriation of other people's territory. In contrast, relation identity, must be relational, is based on the context. No, it is relation? Okay. See, I don't know Glisson very well. Based on the context among cultures,
There are
contacts among cultures that create a chaotic network. Relation opposes the totalitarianism of any monolingual intent, unquote. Glisson's concept of relation is particularly productive in this book precisely because of its refusal of origins. There is no prior, no authentic form or moment that Glisson is trying to recuperate here. As Gary points out, Glisson's notion of relation is grounded in a particular history that perhaps made such a quest or political imaginary for an origin impossible. That is the history of the Middle Passage, anti-Black slavery, and plantation production. As Gary puts it, this plantation matrix, which is Glisson's term, established dehumanizing conditions, which dialectically fueled by what Glisson variously calls detour, diffraction, errantry, creolization, and relation, unquote. I'm deeply sympathetic to Gary's wariness of identitarian and or cultural forms of politics for both intellectual and epistemological and political reasons. I don't buy into its or some version of its epistemological or ontological conceits. And I also share his commitment that the alternative cannot be some abstract, unmarked universalism. But yeah, nevertheless, it's a nice nevertheless. In reading the book, I often felt that references to diversity or difference or singularities operate at such a level of abstraction that I wondered how analytically one would begin to grapple with or imagine or engage the question of singularities or diversity as part of imagining concrete utopianisms. I wonder if, given that not all of our histories are similar to that of Glisson, revisiting and rereading Assad and or Chakrabarty might, Pache, Gary's reading, provide some more concrete, insights. I couldn't avoid that. In short, are there frames, tradition for Assad and history 1 and 2 for Chakrabarty? Are those frames really culturalisms, forms of asserting ontological difference? I'm begin with Walter Mignolo before I get back to Assad, which I focus on. I actually agree with Gary about that Mignolo's concept of the decolonial falls into the kind of culturalism and assertion of ontological difference of which Gary is wary. Mignolo posits, and I'm quoting from the book, incommensurable differences between Western and non-Western epistemologies or civilizations, unquote. He, and I'm quoting again, insists ways of knowing are bound up with particular ways of being, and writes, I am where I think, unquote. What's more, I would argue, and here I'm probably going farther than Gary did, Mignolo seems to presume that there is some decolonial prior to be recuperated, and he looks to indigenous life worlds to find it. Somehow they are not just incommensurable, but seemingly still untouched. It's the only way we can recuperate them. This kind of culturalism mimics an anthropological primitive imaginary of old. Just now it does so in the name of a politics of the otherwise, the decolonial. Now, in other words, there is a very different moral and political conceit. And I too am quite wary. But Assad and Chakrabarty, I think, are doing something quite different. Let me focus on Assad, just because I know his work more thoroughly. He relies, as Gary points out, on the concept of tradition, which he reads via Alistair McIntyre. And he does this sort of in specific in thinking about religion and particularly Islam. But I disagree that Assad's conception cannot incorporate the practices or arguments, for example, of Islamic Marxists or feminists, who, and I'm quoting Gary, may challenge the same forms of conservative piety or political Islam that Western liberals do, but on different grounds and for different aims, unquote. Traditions, in Assad's sense, operate with different grammars and inform different forms of life, but nothing in that claim makes them incommensurable, one from the other, at least not prima facie. Moving away from an anthropological concept of culture, which is often deeply presentist and ahistorical, the concept of tradition, Assad argues, allows us to think about, quote, the conditions that produce meanings and practices and forms of life. Perhaps then his work might allow us to do two things, which may well be different from the direction his work has been taken in by many of his acolytes. First, to think more specifically about what we mean when we say differences or singularity. What are their conditions of possibility? What are their forms that produce particular forms of life? How are they made and sustained over time? And how do they change? Put another way, Assad might provide us with one conceptual frame within which we can begin to have a more concrete conversation about difference as historically produced and ways to explore and engage analytically these singularities. But, and this is my second point, this is not to say that incommensurability is not one possibility that one might run up against, one real historical possibility. In reading the book and its optimism, much appreciated, but I remain a melancholic subject, I was left to wonder, can we so easily set aside those moments of possible incommensurability or non-passage across singularities? As Beth Povinelli points out in the introduction to her Cunning of Recognition, one common move in multicultural theorizing has been to say, we will set the difficult moments aside for the moment. That is, we will set aside those moments and issues that we cannot come to an agreement on, and we will imagine a multicultural society in their absence. And not just because we cannot rationally agree on those moments or issues, but because affectively they can generate disgust. And she uses the response to clitoridectomies as one example in Europe and the US. But aren't those moments of non-passage, aren't those the precise moments with which we need to grapple? To close, I just want to note the conclusion takes a rather different turn. These movements are extremely concrete and decidedly located. And I wanted to think a little bit more about what it means to be located. Black Lives Matter or prison abolitionist movements. One could even argue about the climate change movement. Yes, it speaks to and of the survival of the planet, but it does so nevertheless from particular locations. And the account here makes it sound perhaps more seamless as an internationalist project than I suspect it is. What's more, it's striking to me how many of these examples are US located, some of which have traveled, Occupy Wall Street, some of which less so, Black Lives Matter. I do not say this, Gary, to imply that you need to use other more global examples. I'm also not so sure that staying in America, so to speak, is always necessarily a problem. Not all movements have to be international, have international or global reach. Nevertheless, I want to think about their locatedness and the ways in which, progressive or not, a movement of marginalized and racialized citizens at home can reproduce some of the inequities of imperial power or be blind to them. So let me just pause and say something about it. Summer of 2008, the movement from Gaza to Ferguson, because the invasion of Gaza happens at the same moment as Ferguson. And there were two things about that really struck me in terms of a kind of imperial blindness. One, and this is again a kind of movement that includes Palestinian Americans who unify, and Arab Americans with Black Americans and others in sort of drawing parallels between what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in Ferguson. But in fact, what's happening in Gaza, it's not that there aren't threads, but to read it through an American racial imaginary and structure is a serious problem. The siege of Gaza and its bombardment is much closer to what happened in Fallujah with the US siege of Fallujah. So partly the question is, what is the racial model that is presumed here? But then the second is Fallujah, right? The US is at war, has been at war for 20 years and is still at war. And very little and that fact has not emerged as central in American progressive politics over the last 20 years, and certainly in the rise of Trump. So there's a kind of blindness to the fact of the US as an imperial state, right? So finally, I want to end by returning to Talal Assad. Like Gary, Assad thinks we should take seriously that translation is never easy, never seamless. Speaking to anthropologists, he argues perhaps we have spent too little time thinking about translation as what he calls a scandal. Part of that scandal is what he refers to in an earlier article, Translating Culture, as the problem of unequal languages and the problem those unequal languages pose to the task of translation. Certainly that is true of those worlds at the receiving end of American imperial war and harm that have rarely ever figured, and certainly not prominently, in progressive US politics over the past 20 or more years, even as the US has been and continues to be at war. Now the call then for concrete utopianism, boy, that was a Freudian slip, the imaginative act of seeing the possible impossible, how that call can exceed the frame, and especially in the powerful nations of the North, exceed that imperial frame, and especially in the powerful nations of the North, may be the source of a melancholy that is not just misplaced. What's more, it raises the question of whether or not some internationalisms need not incorporate the North at all. To go back to Samir Amin, who figures prominently in the books, his earlier political imaginary in the 50s and 60s, one that imagined an internationalist politics as structured around the non-aligned movement and what we have come to call the global South. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. And I think I'll come back on some of those themes later, but let's hear first from Fred Moten.
Thank you, Bernard and Kayama and everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I wrote like 4 short paragraphs, but I realized that they were sort of more like the end of something. So I didn't actually have a beginning. So I have to improvise, I guess, the beginning. And in doing so, I run the risk of making it seem like I'm conflating this very powerful and beautiful work that you did, Gary, with some work that I find less so. But it's not. But even if I find this work that I'm going to mention, informally, sort of less powerful and beautiful, it's not because I'm not in a certain kind of way sympathetic with it, and it really goes back to kind of 2 sort of kinds of experiences or of frustration that I know I've been feeling, and that I think a lot of other people, maybe my age, and part of the problem is that maybe the people who are feeling this are my age too. So one is just this kind of feeling of fatigue when it feels like you're constantly arguing with people who you agree with on 99% of everything, and it just feels like a weight, on your shoulders, particularly because so much energy is poured into that not enough energy, it feels like, is directed towards, let's say, who we might all roughly agree to be the enemy. And of course, that thing, that frustration ought to itself be critically examined. Even if it doesn't feel good, it might not necessarily be the case that it's a bad thing. It might just be that maybe we're not comporting ourselves towards one another in the best way that we could. Okay. And then the other feeling is more of the age-related thing that I share with some of my colleagues. We have 2-hour conversations in the afternoon, we're feeling a certain kind of frustration towards some of our students, and about
No idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I believe that over the course, and specifically, within Black studies, for some of us, it has taken a very particular kind of shape over the last 10 years that I think we need to talk about, but in a certain kind of way. And the reason why I bring this up is because there are 2 sort of public instances of this sort of bad feeling or hurt feeling that can sometimes happen. Like it's actually the case that students can hurt their teachers' feelings, and this is 2 instances of it in the last few weeks that I just wanted to briefly mention. And those are the instances that I'm contrasting to what it is that I think that Gary has done in a much more in this very profound and rigorous and elegant way. So maybe part of what I'm trying to talk about is that thing where, you cry out as a function of your hurt feelings. And then maybe that more deliberate kind of thing that can happen when you sort of try to understand the hurt feelings and then think about it a little bit more. And again, I'm not trying to suggest that we denounce and refuse and renounce crying out that immediate outcry. I think they need to be thought together. So, okay. So one instance is there was an article published February 10th in a journal called, I have to look it up because I never heard of this journal before, which is an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. Not that I know every journal, but this that, Jesus, I think it's called Compact Magazine. So Jay always knows what I'm getting ready to say. It's an article by a really interesting and brilliant scholar who teaches sort of theology, political theology at Villanova and Black Studies named Vincent Lloyd. Some of you are probably familiar with some of his work. And it's called A Black Professor Trapped in Anti-Racist Hell. And without going into too much detail, because I don't want to take up more than my time, it's the story of a summer class he was teaching under the auspices of the Telluride Association. And the class just blew up. And one way to think about it is that the Telluride Association, which is this sort of, well-moneyed association that does something like what Mellon Mays does, except for high school kids, and they isolate, or identify promising students of color and ship them off for 6 weeks of a kind of college seminar class at someplace like Cornell, which is where his was. And basically, but what's happened is that over the course of the last 10 years, the alumni of the Telluride Association who take up a lot of the work of administering the association once they've gone through it have become increasingly influenced by, this sort of three-headed monster that we'll call wokeism, DEI / Afro-pessimism. Okay. And the reason why I put it like that is not because I'm here to be I am, woke and I'm old enough to be woke and I'm old enough to not feel some kind of way about being woke, but, I'm also old enough to joke about woke, and in DEI, okay, like I'm a product of it on some basic level. And then at the same time, one sees all of the brutal and vicious ways in which it was always already incorporated into a liberal mechanics of retrenchment that, so we know that too. And obviously, many of us have our own complicated relation to Afro-pessimism, but let's just say that before it became a name or a kind of academic brand, it was always a kind of feeling that animated the thoughts and meditations of most of the Black folks I knew. And it was just simply this basic realization that this shit is fucked up and it doesn't work and it's never going to work. Okay. So that it was always on the cusp of a kind of call for the possible impossible, if you will, right? That's all it ever was. That, and this is why, if you read Afro-pessimism or read Wilderson's work, particularly his work because it's so autobiographical, you always are confronted with the interesting question of where he came from. Like, how did he happen? Well, he had parents. He grew up in somebody's house. And they thought that shit too, even though they just, anyway. Okay. So Lloyd's class got blown up, and because there was a Black graduate student who was also a kind of co-facilitator for the class, though she didn't attend the class, who would sort of undermine everything he did in the classroom at night with the students. And eventually 2 things happened. One, 2 Asian American students who weren't sufficiently converted to this particular kind of critique were kicked out of the class, which there is no possible circumstance in which that shit could be justified. And everything should have been shut down at that moment. But he didn't shut it down at that moment. When the class got shut down, it was because the students then came and read him the riot act, each student reading a paragraph of a critique of him in which they accused him of anti-Blackness. And that's when the class got shut down. Okay. Which is to say, the class got shut down, and he's, very brilliant, smart dude. There is no possible anti-racist credential that he doesn't have. There is no work in the study of anti-Blackness that he doesn't know and hasn't done. And he got accused, and his feelings got hurt. Okay. Now, what's interesting is the discourse that has emerged around this thing is one element of the discourse is that the students were insufficiently committed to the liberal procedure of the seminar. They were insufficiently committed to the kind of work that you can only do in a seminar, and they wanted him to lecture. It was all this thing where they had a kind of, and one element of it that people then took up was the notion that they were so caught up in the identity of their own victimization, right? Like literally, they weren't able to get over, it's a tricky thing. They were caught up in their own victimization, okay? Which then we might say, well, they had been hurt. Their feelings had been hurt. But it's never said that way. It's rather just said that they were insufficiently committed to asserting their own resilience in the face of that victimization. Right. So the imposition of the imperative to be resilient was imposed upon 16-year-olds, right? At the very moment in which they were beginning to discover that maybe, in that way that only 16-year-olds can discover happily if they're lucky enough, somebody else sees that everything is fucked up too. Now, for a whole lot of 16-year-olds, a whole lot of Black, but not exclusively Black 16-year-olds who read books and think, I got one in my house, they read Afro-pessimism and they say, somebody else knows that this shit is fucked up too. Because they've been hurt. Okay. The second example, and I'm sorry if I go on to Naoko Shibusawa, who teaches at Brown in the history department and who just published an essay in 2022. I think it came out after Concrete Utopianism, and I wish she had read Concrete Utopianism before she wrote this essay. But it's an essay it's called Where's the Reciprocity? And again, the villains here, the primary villain, I believe, to keep it short, is Afro-pessimism in this. Which now she makes a distinction between a certain doctrinal Afro-pessimism and something that she calls Afro-pessimism light, which she presumes to be a derivative of doctrinal Afro-pessimism, when in fact it's the precursor, right, of doctrinal Afro-pessimism. And it's just that general sense that Black folks, along with a lot of whole other folks in the world, have said that this is fucked up, right? Just that, and but of course, within the structures of the university and the imposition of scarcity and all the various ways in which various identitarian structures and groupings are made to compete with one another for scraps, conflicts emerge. But of course, those conflicts emerge within the normative liberal procedures of politics. And then the fantasy is that there has been at some point, even though no one can ever really remember when this ever fucking happened, but at some point there was something called coalition, which went against the grain of that, right? It's this it's a kind of empiricist attitude towards coalition, but the coalition that people are having
making this empiricist claim about remember coalition, and everybody's like, no, but we don't, because it never really happened like that, right? It doesn't mean that there weren't all these moments of convergence, but whether or not they ever rose to the level of what it is that we would call a political coalition, or for that matter, sunk to the level of what we would normatively, when I think political coalition, I think Israeli Knesset close to, in the last 2 months. Okay, that's a political coalition. Okay, and or whatever we can, in this instance, there's no reason whatsoever to single out. We can find a meaning. It don't matter what liberal democracy you go to, you can find these moments of convergence of interest, which of course, okay, so, but, and when I bring up Professor Shibusawa, I say, you got to understand, she was writing out of hurt feelings. She felt that the solidarity that she had constantly been showing was not reciprocated. And I believe that she's right. Okay. And so there was a question of like, she wrote because her feelings were hurt. And at the same time, it was in the same way that Vincent Lloyd wrote because his feelings were hurt. But the trouble with writing immediately from the position of your feelings having been hurt is that you sometimes don't get enough time to think about how it is that other people's feelings were also hurt. Okay. And I say all this to say in the most emphatic way, right, that the disciplinary shit that has been imposed upon her is utterly and absolutely wrong. Petitions are out there to be signed to overturn the disciplining that Brown University directed at her ostensibly for writing and publishing this essay, and it should be absolutely overturned. And in my opinion, everybody should say it doesn't, it has nothing to do with the content of what she wrote. It has everything to do with their sense that she violated liberal procedure. Okay, so those are the examples that I'm thinking about, that I was also thinking about in relation to Professor Wilder's text. And now I'm just going to read these 4 paragraphs, and I apologize for taking up so much time. And I hope this makes sense. Anyway, what remains of the necessity for destruction, for radical ideological and ideational dismantling? How do we avoid being caught up in that phantasmatically descriptively false, practically effective, because so brutally ideological assertion of the end of ideology that Daniel Bell made 60 years ago? Daniel Bell, McGeorge Bundy, George Kennan, Hannah Arendt, and Samuel Huntington were part of the first and still dominant wave of anti-wokeism. And the fact that they all did it from a position that then and now most people would describe as liberal must be noted and analyzed. The perils of a kind of emotive, anecdotal rejection of corrosive wokeism, when it is understood to have taken its most virulent form in late adolescent Afro-pessimism, is that it is usually accompanied by recrudescence to the forms and procedures of democratic demonstration and administration, which, in the wave that begins to roll with Bell and crests with Huntington and his fellows, is all about demarcating and enforcing limit on demos, with biopolitics and biopolicy's residual enactments and claims upon sovereignty. At stake is what will have occurred in the frontier between 2 problematic questions. How will the people rule themselves? How will the people be ruled? Pieties regarding the slow productivity of the seminar, which the teacher must still husband in semi-divine invisibility, or empiricist fantasies that confuse intermittences of friendship, sympathy, and regard with the loveless convergence of interest that more properly define and comprise political coalition, continually relinquish the capacity empirically to imagine and practically to sustain the sociality that is the substance, I believe, of what Professor Wilder names and desires under the rubric of concrete utopianism. At stake is what he, after Ellison, calls the boomerang of history, those uncanny, untimely ways that every instance of supposed emancipation created conditions for a new form of racial domination. That's a quote. not only for African Americans, but for the entire global array of African and Afro-diasporic peoples, which is the primary concentration of the book. But Ellison comes in there too, in its relation to what Andaya, the great Afro-Guyanese feminist activist and theorist, refers to by way of George Lamming and Chinua Achebe as betrayal, wherein liberatory aspiration and its material traces are stilled, exploited, and dispersed when, quote, those we nurture and sacrifice into power help not us, but our enemies. The kind of power into which intellectuals are nurtured and sacrificed must now become a matter of concern, not only at the level of what we say and write, but also at the level of how we gather and organize, precisely to consider the social physics, the ethics and ecology and erotics of thinking, gathering, organizing, and fighting. I just said erotics because I'm following behind as close as I can, right? Like Professor Glover. If indeed it's still happening again, and that's a resonant phrase that Professor Wilder's book repeats and echoes. If it's still happening again in the ongoing assault on Black life, then how do we account for the ways that persistence and repetition are held in the very structure of our own thinking in the name of the defense and flourishing of Black life? This question concerns the force of liberalism in the discourse of liberation. And it must effectively note the redoubling of that lingering recrudescence of the "it is still happening again" that had already tainted liberalism's resistance to authoritarianism, or if you'd rather, biopolitics' democratization of sovereignty. But how can we move through the retreat to and review of the classics, which seems only right, in lieu of the hurt feelings that the callous, hyper-individuated nastiness of the recently awakened pessimist induces? When what we need, rather, is a relentless probing of those classics with absolute and violent love in order continually to root out of them and of ourselves the residual sovereignties that animate the liberal, anti-liberatory procedures of civil butchery. This is what Professor Wilder asks in the brilliant and elegant and searching erudition of his asking, he models that more than mere retreat and review and return. But what remains then of the role and force of what might be called negation? I'm interested specifically in the status of a certain phrase, the end of the world, as well as with a certain critical stance towards the history and the promise of interracial coalition politics, and with a certain analytic regarding the constitutive force of a certain understanding of anti-Blackness, all of which are now usually associated with Afro-pessimism. I'm not here to offer a defense of Afro-pessimism or of its primary theorists, proponents, or adherents, and they would hate it if that's what I was here for. No more than I am here to defend negative dialectics or post-colonial cultural theory. I'm here in the wake of Professor Wilder's needful and elegant provocation, which is not an attack on these tendencies, but an extension to them of readerly comradeship and care, to pray and care. But I am here to praise destruction. It's not enough simply to assert that destruction and engagement can be compatible. One would also have to show and continue to enact the history of their compatibility. To be against constructive forms of political engagement is not to be against engagement. The very idea of holistic vision requires us to consider deeply the semantic field or plane that entanglement and engagement imply. What is it to imply? What fold works there or that? But what if there is no politics or political science or theory or theology of entanglement? Rather, what if there is a physical sociality and sociology of entanglement, which will have required a shift of terminology from the translocal to the non-local, just as it will have required this deep investigation of physical and ecological ethics of engagement in entanglement? What if a critical destruction of the metaphysical foundations of politics is inseparable from a constant concern with the ethical practice of engagement? This will have been a matter concerning the techniques of mutual aid, of improvisational curacy, as well as a matter of direction and attitude. What if the afformative blow of the general strike is, in the first instance, proximate caress? What if betrayal is given in the instant of our comportment towards the enemy, which the relay between war and politics demands? What if we help our enemy precisely to the extent that we comport ourselves towards him in that instant of the desire for impossible recognition that is the essence of politics or political life, understood as the necessarily interracial intersubjectivity that concretizes and embodies the human in and for the regime of the concept? Students, rather than being scolded for their failures in liberal intellectual subjectivity, which are all traceable to accepting some status of victim to which they have been relegated by their teachers and the stuff they read, need support in how to figure out what their relationship is to historical and present victimization. Interracial intersubjectivity is a system for the production and distribution of pain. What, on the other hand, might be some good techniques for engagement and entanglement? Where does it hurt? Asked Ruby Sales. What if the beginning of the end of the world, which will have been the end of the self and the body, is given in this question, which is the first question, and in another, how can we make it feel good? Neither of which will have ever been directed towards the enemy. As Professor Wilder knows and shows, this will have been practice, not a game. Socio-aesthetic practice and not the game of honor.
Thank you, Fred.
Those are paragraphs. Important paragraphs. Beautiful.
I'll be very brief before turning it over to Gary so that, and Gary can respond and then we can open it up to some more conversation. As I was listening, Fred, to the first story you were discussing, and I was thinking of, instead of frustration, maybe embracing the continued challenges and the contradictions. And I was thinking, of course, of that last line, or one of those last lines in Raisin in the Sun. I had to figure it out. You know, it was a guy, right, who says, you know, he wants to return to fight. And he says, you know, my own countrymen will step out of the shadows some evening and slit my then useless throat, right? Don't you see? Such a thing as my own death will be in advance. They who might kill me even actually replenish all that I was, right? This notion that in fact, maybe it's embrace of these generational challenges and killings and abolitions that might be productive. And so Gary, I put my questions, I wrote my questions up on the blog, so you've had a chance to get a sense of them. I think that was part of the third question. I'll just go over them quickly. That was part of the third question in part, which is about embracing these contradictions rather than trying necessarily to resolve them. And I think that somehow in the very notion of concrete utopia and concrete utopianism, there's a fundamental tension. And it's the tension between, concreteness and utopianism in a way. It's the tension between wanting to find utopias that are in fact real, really existing. And that's the thrust of concrete utopianism in part. But also to believe in certain things that should be, that aren't yet present. And in a way, concrete utopianism, it doesn't resolve that tension or necessarily some of the tensions, for instance, with Afro-pessimism or negative dialectic. It doesn't necessarily seek to resolve, right? It might just be that, you know, we need to be confronted with these in order to kind of shape our praxis. So that was a question. That was the third question. The second question, I think, very much followed along with Nadia's question, which was an invitation to think more about the question of internationalism and the relationship between domestic struggles and internationalism. And the examples that you gave, again, when I think of prison abolition, something that many of us in this room are committed to and spending a lot of time working on. The American prison the American carceral society is unique in so many ways that, of course, prison abolition always was actually a project that was there were global manifestations of it earlier than there were in the United States, actually. When you think of Matheson's book from 1974, right? These were early forms of prison abolition that come here, but it's not clear today that necessarily in the work of prison abolition in this country right now, it's so much a question of internationalism as dealing with the peculiar institutions, right, that are so unique and exceptional to this country. So that's an invitation to think also through the role of internationalism in these struggles. It might be true also of debt cancellation, another topic that you raise in terms of a concrete utopia. Our student debt structures in this country are somewhat unique, associated with gigantic private universities that make people pay unconscionable sums of money for tuition, right? So it's not necessary. So anyway, so that was the second question, and then I'm going backwards, rolling it backwards. But the first question had to do with the fact that so many of these concrete utopias are concrete utopias that we discuss here in this seminar. Abolition, the Black Lives Matter movement, et cetera, and how exactly, and that we discuss in the undercommons, right? Abolishing a society that could have prisons. How is it exactly that the theoretical and intricate engagement and sparring with the different traditions in contemporary critical theory today changes what we're doing in a way in the streets, right? Does it, or and is that so? How would it concretely change what we're actually doing as, say, abolitionists? So those were the three questions, and I fleshed them out more on the blog. But so that's a lot of different thoughts and reactions, and maybe you could open the conversation for us, and then we can continue it and bring everybody else in.
Let me
Thanks.
begin my thanks. Thank you, Kayama, for curating this, having this idea, bringing us together, and thank you, Bernard, for hosting and creating this space and this frame for this conversation. You get to a certain age and you realize that you don't have to be right, or people don't have to agree with you, but you want to provoke the conversation. And this is just the kind of conversation I want to provoke. Although if this becomes a kind of an adjudication of Afro-pessimism, it would be not this, I mean the conversation about the book. It would be unfortunate, although I'm glad it's on the table, and we will continue to, I'm sure I'll continue to talk about it. There was a kind of, until your 4 paragraphs, I think I had like, okay, I can do this, and this, and this, and then the 4 paragraphs, and then we got these 3 on. So I'm not really sure. I'm torn between answering specific questions because I'm a kind of a completionist, and I want to go all in and go one by one, but I think my brain will explode and I will lose it, and I will just run out the clock. So let me organize myself a little bit and talk to the 3 of you, and then you, although there's also the 2 of you, and then like love, and there's a lot of affect here. A few
Good luck.
hurt feelings and love, but a few things. First of all, my friend, it's interesting when you talk about this stuff. Like, I think I could repeat 80 times in the book, and I probably do 50 times. I'm not an optimist, and this is not about optimism, and yet that's how it's read.
Well, to a melancholic, it seems that.
But the point, but part of what I say when I talk about melancholy is that that my critique of a kind of categorical, a left melancholy, a fatalistic pessimism, a pessimist metaphysics has nothing to do with personal disposition. I mean, I'm as pessimistic as you are, I am sure.
Yeah.
I am sure about the prospect of things being otherwise anytime soon, or anytime in my lifetime, or anytime before the planet is done. And so I think that's interesting, the kind of, and this is not a criticism of your reading specifically, but I think one thing that came up in these comments is this kind of assumption. And Fred, a lot of your comments were about like, the other thing this is not, it's not an anti-woke book. I mean, it's not against wokeism, where it's certainly, although hearing you, I can see how it could play into that discourse in all kinds of ways. But I try over and over through the book to, I curate the thinkers that I'm so excited by, not because they have facile notions of reconciliation, not because they are optimists, and certainly not because they are liberals, but because they begin with as forceful a notion of harm or singularity or specificity or locality or rootedness as almost as those who we regard as some of the fiercest and strongest and most persuasive advocates of that position. And my method is to be with them 80% of the way, 70, 90, it depends, and reach a certain point where I say, it's this turn that I just want to raise as a question. It's this term that I find politically unsatisfying, which is not the same as saying, let's not talk about harm. Let's not talk about destruction. Let's set aside those difficulties. In the translation chapter and when I talk about translation and solidarity and internationalism, I say over and over and over, I mean, I defy you to find the place where I say, let's set aside these difficulties. I say the question is, what do we conclude about the difficulties? Are they the starting point or the proof that the project is impossible? It may be impossible, but I do wonder about the price we pay by assuming that those difficult possibilities of forging some kind of connection across very clear and very painful and very messy differences is not worth taking up. Fred, I think, talked about, gave a very forceful and persuasive and moving account of that harm and that repeated harm and why it may not be worth taking up. But I guess for me, the question, and I'm looking at Fred now, is, I feel like I also begin, I don't have the lived experience of being Black in America, but I also analytically and politically begin with the certainty that things are fucked up and not working and not workable within the liberal frame. So the other thing that I'm struck by all three of these comments is that somehow, and I guess, and maybe I'm mischaracterizing what I'm saying all throughout the book, but I am struck by the quick way in which a conversation about translation or solidarity practices or internationalism, which I explicitly link to a Marxist tradition and certain Black thinkers, not all Black, certain Black thinkers, is somehow read as a kind of residual liberalism. And my whole point in this book, one of the points, there are many whole points, and I'll stop and let you respond. But one of my points in this book is to say, fuck that. That cannot be. Those cannot be the choices. That either things are deeply fucked up, or we have some facile, optimistic, liberal idea that we can all get along or something. So the end of the world, that's a revolutionary proposition. And I also, maybe we can talk about the difference between the end of the world and the end of this world. And we can. So, sorry, I see that you have something bubbling. So.
No, the only reason I'm sure I'm going out of my turn, but so some of what I guess I'm thinking right now has to do with this very complicated feeling of being really, really happy to be here, and at the same time thinking that there's something really, really wrong with the protocols of this particular kind of gathering, because I was agreeing with you, man. And the reason why I brought up those other two examples was because I was saying, what you do is not like.
Yeah,
what
yeah,
they
no,
do.
I heard that. I heard that.
And to the, if there's any, and for instance, for me, and I don't know if y'all know this great theologian and activist Ruby Sales, but when she asked, where does it hurt? It's precisely this profound gesture of solidarity and translation. That's really what that question is. There's something that you feel, and I can see that you feel it, but you need to tell me a little bit something more about it. There needs to be just a little bit of language so that I can be with you in this feeling. That's exactly what she's doing. So I feel like that's a lot of what your book is. That's advocating precisely what you. So what I'm saying is that the protocols, even the protocols of sort of academic disputation or academic commentary, it's as if they come so close constantly to constantly reviving some residual hurt that we all have of having been misunderstood. Right. And I'm saying, no, I don't think I'm with you. I'm not against you.
No, I know that.
But what I'm saying is and then specifically with this question of because this is Andaya's question. Andaya's question is, it's like, how does this keep happening? How does this betrayal keep happening given everybody's good intentions? How wouldn't it be necessary for us not to accuse each other of liberalism, but rather constantly to be vigilant about the liberalism that probably just can't help but be embedded in our liberationist discourse? Those two words are connected for a reason. And it's not accusing anybody. It is just saying this is something we would have to constantly be vigilant about, and so returning to Glissant would mean reading Glissant, reading for residual liberalism in Glissant by way of Glissant's critique of liberalism.
Yeah, there's a lot of liberalism in Glissant. Wouldn't we, in the spirit of conviviality, I love the patient work of the seminar. That was one of your lines, right? Beautiful. So forget these protocols. And certainly I am, feeling misunderstood gets me out of bed in the morning. So that is not,
What to make of that?
no, but I think maybe part of that interrogation you're talking about is about also slowing down and saying, let's try to, and I'm not accusing anyone, but let's try to distinguish between the long history of the entanglement of liberty and liberalism, though liberty is not a term I use a lot in here. Emancipation is a term, for better or for worse. But that, the question is what we do about that long history, what we do about the boomerang of history. And I think part of the task is, again, not to stop at the recognition of that deep, fatal. I mean, maybe it's unsurmountable link between liberalism and liberty, and I think part of the animus or the friendly agonism, and I'm glad, Fred, that you saw that most of the thinkers I was disagreeing with, I was taking very seriously and not attacking. But I think part of the question is what we do again about the boomerang of history, about that link, whether we stop with that recognition. And I guess I've had a sense that in the academic world, within critical theory, so often, and this is the tools that we have forgotten to pick up, and maybe you guys don't agree with me, but that we have learned to stop
at the recognition of that bad entanglement without saying, well, then what? And there's the kind of transgression for transgression's sake. There's retreat. There's intoxication. There's there's a kind of refuge. They're all reasonable responses to what, under these conditions, is an impossible situation, for sure. But I think, the end of the world, or the end of this world, is another reasonable and realistic way forward, since this is not going to work. As you said, shit is fucked up and it's not going to work. But it is, part of my hope in here is that we can remember traditions of thinking about the end of the world that isn't just stuck in the impasse of it's never going to work. It doesn't mean I know how it will work or that it will work, but that there are traditions, revolutionary traditions of not just wishing for otherwise, but making the world otherwise. So in that sense, I'm not against the destruction that you're talking about, that I think you invoked at all. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, but
Well,
look over to this side of the table.
okay. Well, one thing we can do also in terms of disrupting the usual academic forum, which we try to do here, is to actually bring folks in so that there's also some engagement and conversation. So the minute you want in, just tell me, okay? Yeah, I mean, one of the things I take it about this question of the end of the world in your book itself is that the planetary solution that you're proposing, embracing, right, from an internationalist perspective, doesn't allow for falling into too much of a morose take on the end of the world, I take it. I mean, in other words, like it's fine for us old people to talk about the end of the world, but I mean, there's all of our students, young and the younger generations, they can't be as flip about it, I take it. But I take it that's part of your argument, right?
Okay. Let me wind back a little bit so I'm not misunderstood about, because I want to come up with the localism. Oh shit, it's a personality defect. It's hardwired. But come back to the kind of local and locality. I certainly, I have that moment where I talk about how popular sovereignty, collective self-management is both necessary for human freedom and a necessary obstacle to human freedom in an entangled world. So I certainly am not in a one-sided way ever in here saying planetary internationalism as opposed to, I'm opposed to provincialisms, but not localism. Throughout the entire book, I say, I repeat these sentences over and over about finding ways to relate collective self-management or popular sovereignty or autonomy, whatever you want to call it, to interdependence, to entanglement, to translocal practices, to transversal alignments. I don't have a one-size-fits-all claim that every single political act or engagement has to follow some kind of planetary formula, but I do believe that the harms that we are up against have to be understood in the frame of forms of domination that exceed any self-managing community. So and that the entanglements I'm talking about, that's not either wishful thinking or something I'm condemning. It's just, to me, that is empirical. That is a fact of the world we live in. So any project for social justice or human freedom has to reckon with the kind of scale of those harms. That doesn't mean that every single act has to be international. It certainly doesn't mean that there's a single political subject, and it certainly doesn't mean that there's some Comintern that is directing all of this. Although I am taken by Samir Amin's non-liberal call,
Really? He's being a little bit.
non-liberal call for a new internationalism of peoples. And he also continually says, we need a post-Bandung project of the South, for the South, and these harms affect all the people on the globe, and the North itself is divided in precisely the ways we're talking about. I mean, these are racial formations, for example, not only, they're divided in many ways, so that anything, any kind of new internationalism must include the North, should include the North as well, if it's going to be effective. So I think through here, hearing your responses through here, I think there are times when the examples I give, and this is not a book about examples. I mean, that's just the kind of hastily written conclusion that was, it's not a book about examples, but the example, when I talk about examples so that people can understand part of what I am talking about, I'm torn because most of the time I'm trying to give examples of what I mean by concrete utopianism, which is not concrete utopias. It's utopianism, indexes an orientation and a practice and a kind of way of seeing and thinking and knowing and doing that links the actually existing mess we have to the prospect, to the potential for different kinds of arrangements. But I also, in using those examples, I say, and look at this, even these local things are very international. There's a global dimension in so many of these projects. So I think, internationalism, sometimes I go from solidarity to internationalism. I'm as interested in, so on the one hand, and I'll stop here for a second, in 1 second. On the one hand, I do believe that this keening to one world, I love that line. I do believe that in this one world that is harming so many in so many ways, that there can't be socialism in one country. There can't be emancipatory projects that are restricted to, I mean, you can do a lot in small places. You can do a lot in refuge, in places of refuge, in intentional communities, but so on the one hand, I do believe that the harms we're up against require a different scale of thinking about these things. On the other hand, when I talk about internationalism, solidarity, translation, partly, I am so taken by that Leninist formula of transform the imperial war into a civil war, which is not to say that we're all one, or if we just kind of like set aside these differences and difficulties, we will realize sameness and or common purpose. And I'm certainly not talking about abstracting from differences to come up with this underlying same thing. But I am saying that in any given situation, at all the scales, we cannot know in advance what the primary axes of division and possible alignment are, and that they have to be discovered and they have to be constructed. And that's not easy. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how that will happen. But I think in that, you were practicing that kind of translation in precisely the ways you were talking about Gaza and Ferguson. So I'm not talking about a practice of translation that, again, erases those differences in order to kind of have this transparent sameness, or to translate one experience into another register. But so anyway, it's that. So internationalism, I think, maybe, my fault certainly for using it in a kind of in multiple ways, let's say. But I think the transversal is as important as the translocal, and the translocal can operate on many scales. The translocal could be, within a region, and it could be the planetary. But
Can I just say,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, look,
Please.
I was not saying that. We're into that one. I didn't mean to imply that. I think that, well, obviously, I said you're not trying to create a sameness, and I know that in the structure of the book, you're talking about translation. I said, like, you know, Assad's words as a scandal is partly, I think, what you're doing. It's not easy the way Geertz would have thought translation was easy. But I think the question about, and I don't think anybody is reading this as saying you're creating a model here, but I think why the conclusion is interesting and important in relation is in some ways to get to this, to begin to sort of imagine, this is what I was thinking through the book, and then we got to it at the conclusion, to begin to imagine what concrete utopianisms might open up or imagine along this axis of singularities and sort of transversals and internationalisms, right? When you get to the end, there's something about thinking more concretely about the locatedness, not the local, but what it means to be located and what we mean when we say singularities and how we might think with and through them, that I think is as important. And that because of the nature of the theorizing and the people you're drawing on, it's that question of the difference or the diverse or the singularity remains at a level that I think is not quite up to the overall project. So that's what I think the importance of the end is. And again, I agree. It's not, I didn't mean to accuse you of being like James Taylor? No, that can't be his first name. Taylor. But
Charles Taylor.
I'm really doing well with names here. Charles Taylor. Because obviously they are literally setting aside all the difficult moments. But I thought it was interesting, and this was more of an aside, that the idea of incommensurability and that possibility is just something, and I get it as anthropologists, oh my God, incommensurability and cultures can drive one nuts. But I often think about political incommensurabilities, like what it means to be so attached to an ideology that it really is incommensurable, right?
For sure.
And there's a kind of allergicness to even the possibility, which is different than difficulty, of incommensurableness or incommensurabilities in this political imaginary you're trying to produce. And on the one hand, I get it, but that's also the world we live in. So how one could sort of begin to try to think that, I don't have an answer either. I'm just saying, I kind of responded a little bit to the kind of allergicness.
But what about Glisson, who has that great line where he says, I do not need to understand my neighbor to be in solidarity with my neighbor.
Yeah, but sometimes I refuse to be in solidarity.
For sure.
That's a different kind of.
Samira means political judgment.
To understand is different. That's more the anthropological translation. Okay. There's the, it's like, I don't know, I was listening to a lecture, and then I'll be quiet too. I'm never really bad with names. Supancic, is that how you pronounce her name? And she talks about the problem of disavowal. And we're all reaching the end of the world, and we all got to get off the train, but nobody's willing to jump off the train, right? And there's a sense of we can create it, and it's because we're also individuated. So it's like if we could create it, we need a collective in order to jump off the train together. But what if I have a collective and you have a collective, and my jumping off the train? I'm not jumping off the train because it's okay for me. It's just not okay for you. That's the question of incommensurability to me. That's something of how do we grapple with that, which is a kind of singularity. That
there are politics, there are enemies, there's a war. We're in a war.
Right. Okay, we're in a war.
Yeah. I mean,
that's true. No.
Sorry. I guess following Glisson. No, I mean, I hear you. I wonder if it's even fruitful to try to think about relation without making commensurable, without commensurability.
Yes. But I think there's.
But then there are hard lines. Then there are hard lines. There are hard lines.
Trying to open up for it.
Why don't we open it up a little bit? I
have to talk to Kayama's point, so I want to make sure to get there.
Okay.
But please, let's open it up. We can come back around.
Kendall Thomas, and then
I've been conscripted. I'm sure there are other people who have other questions. I want to shift what I've taken to be a focus, at least in these last few exchanges, on the question of solidarity, and to return to the question of temporality. And I want to do so by way of a text that I found helpful in trying to wade through these very rich interventions. And that, Gary, is your little piece that you wrote a few years ago in one of my favorite little journals, Political Concepts, on anticipation. Because I think what you have to say there about the politics of anticipation, I'm just going to read a little bit of what you say in that essay. We can think of anticipation as a kind of political disposition whereby radical actors cultivate a state of readiness for any political possibility and a will to overcome existing arrangements by acting from the standpoint of a not yet redeemed world. From this perspective, anticipation prefigures by enacting the supposedly impossible. It indexes a political temporal orientation rather than an affective state or an ideological discourse. And one of the things I find interesting about your saying what you write when you say in this essay is that you've just offered us the example of the Black radical tradition. So you talk about Du Bois, you talk about Gilroy, you talk about Moten on the traditions of Black improvisational music. And so the question that I want to ask is from within a Black, within the perspective of Black radical tradition, because I was thinking about this enacting a future which has not yet arrived. Took me back to a piece I wrote several years ago in which I discussed, among other things, an event which took place 63 years ago this month, the Greensboro sit-ins, where a group of Black college students from a local college went to the local Woolworths, sat in at the lunch counter, filled up all the seats. They were not allowed to eat at the Woolworths. That is to say, they did not have the right to eat at the Woolworths, but they sat down anyway and enacted a futurity that had not arrived, right? They did not have the right to do it, but they performed rights that might exist in a future which had not yet arrived. And they did so, I imagine fairly pessimistically, because they knew that however nonviolently and pacifically they acted, they were going to catch hell, right? They were going to get beaten or perhaps worse. So in thinking about this question of concrete utopianism as a disposition toward the future, and in drawing on the Black radical tradition, I'm just wondering what utility the concept of anticipation might have for these conversations that we're having right now, that might move the conversation along, right? Because I'm sensing a kind of impasse around certain concepts like liberalism, right? And they were fighting for rights, which constitutional rights, that's a liberal democratic concept. But they were doing so in the most arguably radical way by enacting a concrete utopianism in the teeth of the kinds of violence whose recurrence in the years since is precisely what has given rise to Afro-pessimism, right? And yet, we are their heirs. What is it about that moment and this moment, right, that makes the politics of anticipation that they practiced in 1960 so thoroughly unattractive? Can you use this concept of anticipation to sympathetically try to understand the life world and the perspective of the 16-year-old, right? Who knows that things are fucked up, even though they can, if they have the money, go to the Woolworths and eat, right? So there's that kind of futurity, and yet the sense, all these many years later, which I do not think is not without foundation, of no future, right? And I think I feel some obligation, although I'm a member of the I Have a Dream generation, right? Quite literally, I'm the same age as Martin Luther King Jr. III, right? But, you know, I want to honor and try to understand what it is that makes the Afro-pessimistic philosophical perspective so resonant among the generation, the Trayvon generation, right? And I'm hoping that, you know, this idea of anticipation and its attractions or disenchantment about it might be one way, for me at least, to understand this conversation and what the stakes are.
Thanks, Kendall. Do you want to? How do you?
Sure. Whatever. Happy to jump in.
Yeah, I think it would be good, and then we can bring somebody else in Fonda in the
And I'm
back.
sure other people.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Gary. I thought because I thought that was very constructive.
There's so much packed in there.
Proposition.
I can't do justice to it, but you bring up, since you start with temporality, you bring up two reasons why thinking about kind of punctual time doesn't do it politically. The reason why that gesture doesn't resonate now is what Ellison calls the boomerang of history, or, you know, Gleason also calls this painful sense of time. This is the kind of structural, systemic anti-Blackness that is woven into the very fabric of this society and this political formation that will not be overcome through, you know, reformist reforms. It will not be overcome through liberalism. It will repeat again and again and again. So on the other hand, you're also bringing up this kind of prefigurative practice of anticipation that I talk about. And I think you're absolutely right that in that moment of the sit-in, those were practices of anticipation. There was no way, I don't know that we can look back and say, you know, that was because, you know, openings and ruptures come at different moments. So I'm not sure that we can, I wouldn't want to denigrate those practices at that moment. But I think the key thing about anticipation, this notion of anticipation, is that it pushes against the idea that first we have a plan and a program and a formula, and then we enact it. It's through these practices that we somehow come to understand what is possible. Although I also, you know, passionately write about, call for these practices of political imagination, where somehow thinking what's not, you can't possibly think, because the terms of that thought can only come from a future that doesn't yet exist, but somehow there's a poetics involved in there. And so many of the people I do write about with excitement in the book practice that, both the Marxists and the Black critics. And it's that circle between thinking the unthinkable and only being able to do so through these anticipatory practices that may or may not shift things. So again, there's an argument against a formula, a single formula. I mean, I think, you know, in part to come back to where we started, Afro-pessimism is where what we loosely, as Fred was saying, you know, it's not, you know, there's a lot of the kind of various sentiments and propositions and conclusions that we bundle together in there is attractive because of precisely what we've been talking about, the boomerang of history, the fact that so much does not change, the fact that there is this repeating harm, the fact that that anti-Blackness is woven into the very fabric of this social order. I think, and you guys, we can have a big debate about this. I think in part it's so attractive because we don't have a lot of robust revolutionary traditions. We don't have a robust left, and the left we've had has a long history of anti-Blackness also. And being, you know, the labor unions and the political parties and the theory has a long history of being Eurocentric and racist. And yet there is a long tradition of Black Marxists, for example, who, you know, might offer a different kind of way of telling that story between that moment and this moment that doesn't require a metaphysical claim that the present we have will repeat forever and ever with certainty. I don't think we have a lot of alternative idioms and traditions and kind of collective practices for I mean, I don't know, other people have other ideas, although
I'm a theorist and a sex worker as well. I did.
Wow.
And it's okay. And one of
For the Zoom.
Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. And one of the things that I do that's anticipatory is I call myself President Crossan. So I do that with other leaders that I work with. We call each other president, you know, and it may seem obnoxious online when people see us doing that because we are unknowns, but we have to do that because we're Pan-Africanists. You feel me? And I believe in a united Africa, and that's what I work for, you know? So I feel like that's a tradition that I'm creating, and I hope that other people do the same thing. You know, if there's other Black people in the room who are not doing it, do it. Call each other president, you know? And you are a Black president and you are not Obama. You know what I mean? Do it. There's nothing wrong with that. We have to do this stuff. You feel me? And that's how I find peace, because it's a nightmare. This is a nightmare. We're living in a nightmare. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you. This is so beautiful. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that intervention. We have another, and feel free to introduce yourself as well.
Hi, hello. Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. My name is Elliot. I was an undergrad at Wake Forest, and I am writing a thesis on solidarity. So this is a very interesting and very engaging topic for me. So my question, I kind of have a question, and then I have just some thoughts. When I first started researching solidarity, I was talking to a philosophy professor on how to define solidarity, and he said there's a strike happening just right down the path for workers' rights who are working at the dining hall. And it was, he said, if you want to know about solidarity, go talk to them and go stand in solidarity and go see what it's actually like. And I think there's a big difference between the theorization of solidarity or the concept of solidarity and the way it's been practiced, not only in the US, but also in Europe, is my more point of reference, point of departure from this. So I guess my question is, what concept of solidarity should I be epistemically sensitive to as you frame it in your book? Because I haven't, with all due respect, and apologies, I haven't read your book. Placing concrete, is this a project of affective solidarity or organizational solidarity? And for the sake of metric, thinking of a history of solidarity, is this solidarité in solidum with liberal solidarność embedded in what framework of solidarity, or what solidarity is actually being emancipated in your project? Is my question. Or what is the concept? Because that's where I'm at right now.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, that might be a good grounding point, a good concrete grounded place to address. Do we have more? Do we have any other? Yeah. Okay. Che, why don't we take two more, and then we'll Che, and then in front, and then Gary. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much. This has been so rich. I think I'm still sitting with your question, Kendall, about the anticipatory and the Greensboro sit-ins. And I guess I had a question, I think, because Fred, I think you talked or mentioned interest convergence. And I've been reading a lot of Derek Bell, like Silent Covenants. And I know that Afro-pessimism was being discussed, but I'm actually curious about critical race theory. with its roots in a kind of legalism, but maybe it exceeds that. And I'm just curious if folks have thoughts, especially since it's in so much circulation right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Jay. Let's also pass the mic up front here. Okay.
I just wanted to thank
Wait,
everyone.
what's your name?
Oh yeah, my name's Jordan Daly. I just wanted to thank everyone on the panel for being here and for organizing this. This is a truly wonderful event. I guess my question in some ways is selfish. Do we have a model for what it means to be human? You know, like, do we know what it means to get together? You know, like to be hurt, to cry, to be with each other, to be erotic with each other, to feel, you know, the room. Is that too abstracted for us? Do we need a reminder of what that is? And I think, yeah, you know, if we don't have a model, I guess I would like to know what that is, because I feel like I have difficulties being human every day, surviving here. And so to have a pragmatics of being human or becoming humans, right, is a kind of question that I'm concerned with. What does it mean to be human? But that's all I got.
Thank you. Thank you. Alessandra, did you want to jump in?
Good evening, and thank you for this night. I'm Alessandra, and I wanted to do a commentary and a question. The commentary is a paragraph that I always quote. I think it's Borges. He says, "We may act as if we were free. We may act as if we don't have any border." Then I am a stage director. Then this "as if" it's quite interesting to me. The commentary was about maybe a vast and expansive mental view, which in your book is suggested to accompany the analysis of the real. Then maybe the utopia, the concrete utopia you say when you say that maybe sometimes they are already with us as an accident, as a dépense, something that maybe it's not visible, but it's already there. And I always think about Italo Calvino in the last words of a work which is quite utopic, I think, is Città Invisibili, Invisible Cities. When he ends, it says, we may act trying to, in the hell, well, a lot I've heard today, we are in the fact word, in the hell, to catch what is not hell, and to keep and maintain and keep working. Then about the as if, I have a question, because what is concerned with the mimetic arts, and you speak a lot of that in the book. We didn't speak about that this evening, but I think
About what?
the mimetic arts, like cinema, photography, or theater as well. And of course, we are aware that for that these arts have been used as manipulated and oppressive and systematically enslaving tool by a regime of control, like the Catholic Church or the white supremacy or the Third Reich. And then my question is so simple as what Benjamin was asking on photography. He was suggesting, well, we don't just have to forget the artwork and multiply the ways of production, but we have to verify that these tools, they're not again in the circle of media. They are not possessed by the big system of the media and the control. Then my question, Gary, and maybe that this question I should answer, but I ask you because you do this question in your book. No, because I'm really a theater director, and I always think about that, because there is a contradiction. How we can make the invisible become visible as an artist in a société de spectacle. How we can be visible without being captured. How we can be visible in a world where all is all is assumed immediately by the regime of control. Thank you.
Okay, so we have actually, maybe we just, Dorothea, why don't we have one more? I know it's too much, but on the other hand, I want to hear from people and bring it in. And then maybe, Gary, you could address some of these, and maybe we could go down the table also and have reactions to some of these different thoughts, including kind of anticipation, et cetera. So Dorothea, and then Gary, and then we'll come across the table. Go ahead.
Hi, Dorothea. I think I'm kind of at a loss of how I think I'm not entirely happy with how I'm going to phrase this question, but I'm at a loss for how to phrase it better. I'm interested in, I guess, how concrete utopianism, I guess, speaks to problems of solidarity across different vectors of oppression. I think I was particularly thinking of the passage that I believe Abu al-Hajj brought up about Islamic Marxist and Islamic feminist challenges to conservative forms of Islam, and kind of trying to think about that in relation to a chapter from another wonderful book by a different author, Catherine McKinnon's Feminism Unmodified, when she speaks about in her chapter Whose Culture, when she speaks about feminist challenges to a tribal law, a US Native American tribal law that she regarded as in some ways patriarchal. She talks about kind of the difficulties of navigating between I guess between on the one hand this difficult history in the United States of settler colonialism, and of course the difficult history of sexism that she's speaking to more directly. I guess I'm wondering, is there, I think you speak quite a lot about the relationship between kind of theorists who place themselves in this position of particularity and critique kind of universalism or cosmopolitanism. I'm kind of wondering, does concrete utopianism have a way of, I guess, dealing with relations across different particularities? That's all.
Thank you, Dorothea. So we'll come back to you, Gary, maybe, and you can address some of these.
You have 5 minutes.
Where to begin? I'm still thinking about Kendall's question also, and the practices of anticipation. And I think I could maybe link it a little bit to Alessandra and some of this question of being human, maybe try to, and bring it back to Kayama. Can I do that? It's not here. I don't know what this is. Because I don't know what this is either. But I mean, you know, that anticipatory practice of the sit-in is also, you know, it's a brave act. They put their lives on the line. It was anticipating a future, and also back to the kind of precedent. There's an aesthetics to all of this, and I don't mean what I mean is that, you know, part of breaking the frame, part of this impossible attempt to think what we do not yet have the terms to think, is what art is and what art can do. And I don't think, you know, we should just think of art as the actual poem on the page, though it's also that. But I think, you know, that moment of the sit-in is an aesthetic moment that brings together a kind of practice, a hope, a risk, a kind of builds, forges connections in that in that moment, part of these anticipatory practices and part of these solidarity practices are not just a matter of pre-constituted entities that are self-contained and whole that come together in that coalition that Fred was talking about, which is, one way of thinking about it, and there are histories of that, but that's a little different from the ways in which these kinds of solidarity practices and anticipatory practices and these moments of conviviality, and I think aesthetics and erotics go together here. The love and the conviviality go together as practices that produce certain kind of spaces that allow for different kinds of subjectivities to emerge and different kinds of we's to emerge. Again, not that, one knows ahead of time what will happen, not that you follow some kind of formula, but I guess I am interested in, on different scales, the way in which these kinds of risky practices and attempts at translation, the Ferguson Palestine moment may be fraught with misunderstanding and attempts to each to subordinate the other, and yet something might emerge there, some kind of, which is different from abstracting from differences in order to say, oh, look, we are the same now. Through the practice, something else emerges. And I think that is, there's a temporality there, and there's a poetics in that. I think there's a reason why Césaire talks about poetic knowledge and Glissant talks about a poetics of relation. And I think this, that is linked. I want to try in a very fumbling way, since I probably only have 2 minutes now, which is fair. I want to hear from everyone. This business about being human. And certainly there is no model for being human, but I think we can clearly say that certain kinds of systemic arrangements make it possible, asymmetrically impossible for anyone to be properly human, whatever that means. And I say that advisedly. I know the moment you say properly human, it is, it creates a lot of problems. And I think there's an asymmetry to that impossibility. But I think capitalism and racism and instrumental rationality and technocracy and all of these things make it. We have learned something about modernity, that human capacities cannot be allowed to develop in all of their potential ways under these arrangements. And yet the concern, which again, Fred, I'm arguing with my own former self always in these moments, that concern that I certainly came up with and took very seriously, of the harms that emerge the moment you invoke that category of the human, the normative imposition of one notion of being human that can be deeply problematic, deeply harmful, can reproduce all. We know that. I'm not laying that aside, but I am saying again that's the starting point. I think we have, at least in the modes of thought that I am calling into question or feeling kind of airing my frustration with, maybe, I was going to say I am not writing out of hurt feelings, but I sound like a guy writing out of hurt feelings. So I will take that seriously and think about that. But I think we have, we've had for 50 years, it has become deeply problematic to even raise the question you raise. Again, I know you're not accusing me of liberalism, but it does seem like, that post-structuralist and post-colonial theory does make that link between any invocation of the human and a kind of liberalism, which is why I talk about both, Glissant's notions of being human, for example, Césaire's notions of being human, for example, but also Marx's notion of human emancipation. And I think we've lost a lot, or we pay a certain kind of price. I mean, there's dangers in using that language, and yet, can we think about that and I don't know how you guys got the idea I'm not into negative dialectics. Adorno is one of my guys, and I am all negative dialectics. All the way. So I wonder if we can think, both think about the necessity to not just ask your question, but to kind of break the frame of this kind of table and all these things to kind of go into also the space again, not in a sentimental, not a liberal sentimental mode, but in a kind of radical, associative, solidaristic, risky process of kind of self-alienation in a certain way, where it's both, exhilarating and terrifying, and there will be harms for sure. But and I think, aesthetics and erotics and love in all the iterations of love are crucial at this moment. And I think the kind of the two traditions I talk about, and there are a lot of them, and they're not singular traditions, give us concepts and resources and frameworks for starting out fiercely critical about existing arrangements that will never allow for human happiness, and yet go to both of these places, including your place and including your place. And I think we need to remember that's what I would say. Sorry.
Okay, why don't we go down the table?
I haven't forgotten your question, but
Brett, do you want to jump in?
Caused enough trouble already. No. Well, I guess I'm always kind of struck by and stuck in this particular conundrum, which is I can listen to my friends talk and I say, I think I know exactly what you mean and I agree with it, but I wouldn't say it that way. And I think it's probably really important to not say it that way.
Okay.
I don't know how to, I don't know how to deal with that problem. Particularly because then in the very divergence, in that very moment of differentiation, for instance, everything, I believe that everything that I think and that I hope that Glissant means by relation is what I would subscribe to, except I would use the word differentiation. Okay, so that moment of differentiation, that's the way relation works. Okay, so but the metaphysical assumption of individuation, the metaphysical assumption of world, of self, of body, the assumption that thinking is in the first and last instance conceptual. These have implications. And one of the implications is it makes it really hard for us to get together. And I also believe that the invocation of the human really, again, I know what you mean and I'm with you. I agree with you, but I can't say it that way. And I think it matters that it, so that's why I was saying, really, this, of course, this very problematic to me is the condition of possibility and the condition of necessity of translation as an act of solidarity. Right? That's all that's what that is. So how do we get together in difference, right? How do we gather so that we can improperly disperse, right? This is, how do we have a party, or orgy, whatever, how do we play some music? It's the same question. I guess I'm just convinced, but it might just be being picky. It might just be a function of being a certain kind of nerd that, it just feels really important to use to investigate. I don't think I have the right words for any of it, but to continually ask these questions so that we can dislodge any word from ever seeming as if it were the right word.
So Dorothea, is that your name? So maybe I'll just say, I think the thing is, I think your question actually hits sort of nail on the head, which is that it's my obsession with the possibility of incommensurability. Any kind of sort of internationalism or solid, right? One can say it is both translocal and internationalist or movements of solidarity, and yet we recognize singularities. But any political project is also a normative project, right? So there are some singularities that a feminist is not going to abide by, right? So I think that is the kind of moment of non-passage. And to talk, so almost seamlessly about the kind of singularities that one, of course, will recognize within these kind of more concrete, solidarity or not universal, I guess, utopianism's projects, right? That it's a normative political project, and there are certain singularities that are definitionally excluded. And I think that we slip too easily sometimes, or maybe like we have to sort of gesture towards, of course, diversity, of course, difference, but there are differences that we're not so ready to get on board with. And that's the piece that I think what has to be owned in a different way. So I don't have an answer, but I think the question is, at the kernel of that contradiction or the impossible is there, right? And those aren't the kinds of solidarities you can say, well, I can either agree that we don't see the world the same or agree to disagree. There are certain things you're not going to agree to disagree on, right? Yeah.
You just gestured toward me.
Oh my goodness.
I would call that politics, what you just mentioned.
No, of course, but
That's politics.
That's working through what specifically do we mean by singularities? How do we engage them? What are their concrete forms? What are the moments where translation is not just a scandal or difficult, right? And that, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
My obsession.
I agree.
Yeah.
We've come to an accord. I would just add that, and this is in reference to Madam President's intervention and the question of the human, something that strikes me just in listening to this debate is thinking about why we are more comfortable in some ways in these contexts, arguing with one another and contesting perhaps than we are in questions that are maybe more fundamental about how to be and that are more worrisome because the answers are a bit more difficult and maybe don't have tomes of volumes that are telling us that story. And so maybe we don't think those questions belong in these spaces. But I'm curious about a world in which those are the first questions that organize gatherings like this. For me right now, I'm thinking about the erotic as one of those really thorny, like, what is she talking about here? Like, why? Questions that might open doors in different directions than the arguments that are so well trod. And that even though we're feeling perhaps antagonistic or contested, we're actually comfortable in those antagonisms. And that's worrisome, especially when we're all claiming to be on the same side. So it's weird how much we find. And so, yeah, when you kind of burst into, and I've also been watching how you write in your notebook, it looks like poetry, what you're doing. He doesn't fill a whole page. He has like these lines of notes. Just, it's a different way of being in the space. And it's harder than some of the ways we're used to talking to one another as we respect one another as intellectuals and scholars and students. So,
Yeah, so I would say that at this point, I'm a little bit stuck on the notion of being misunderstood. Which somehow plays such an enormous role in this conversation. And wondering how the notion of feeling misunderstood relate how it's possible how to deal with that in a context of this agonistic kind of these agonistic engagements that are really agonistic. Like, in other words, how can you actually have agonism when you have being misunderstood? Or is there any way in which that can be productive? I take it that, when I come out of reading the Undercommons, I was going to look for a passage and a few passages of it, but when I come out of reading that, I really feel as if it was extraordinarily brilliant critique, in part, of the just facade of kind of academic agonism in a way. I felt that more than anything, I felt it was aimed that it hit hard at us critical theorists and our discourse in a way. And so right now I'm a little bit back to my original question, I think, ultimately. And that's where I probably end up with if I were to say, feeling both misunderstood and not addressed, is how does this kind of agonistic, misunderstood quagmire that we seem to be in, like, change in any way what I do in terms of my abolitionist practice? So I think that's kind of like, that's where I end up feeling unsure and totally misunderstood, Gary. Totally misunderstood.
We can, happy to come back around to that question, but I'd like to say something to or kind of speak with Fred about that. Your last thing you said, how do we get together in difference? How do we gather so we can improperly disperse? This having a sense of the thing and being endlessly frustrated with all the attempts to name it. Now you can't, now I'm all self-conscious. I can't say, just to be clear, but I'll say that anyway. To be clear, I certainly don't think I've cracked that nut in any way or have some name. And maybe this didn't come through, but what I hope comes through, because I love that you just said that, Fred, because in a sense, I am moved by the feeling, and maybe this is, like Kayama said, there's the kind of painfully obvious, painfully banal parts of so much of this, but I am moved by a strange urgency that's the question. I mean, it's a question that works on the kind of the most intimate interperson, from the orgy to the party to the polis, that kind of, you framed it and phrased it so well. And that's, in a sense, this thing. So I don't feel frustrated. I wouldn't use the language of quagmire. I think these are the kind of spaces, this is the kind of work, this is kind of the conversation that is, I don't draw some instrumental line between we do this and, we get $8 billion or $11 billion from the NYPD. But I do think that this kind of, how do we get together in difference? How do we gather so we can improperly disperse? Now that may seem like it rolled right off your tongue because you struggle with that and you think about that and you reflect on that in all kinds of powerful ways. But I don't see that as the center of our conceptual conversations, our strategy conversations, our political practices. Maybe effectively they always are underneath that. But I feel like so often the stories I'm given or the ways I'm asked to think about these things slide into kind of either ors that are not, don't have the quality of what you just put on the table. So in a sense, I feel like, yeah, that's, you know, that's the plea. That's the urgent plea in this book. And it certainly doesn't start with, I've sorted it out. And if we just go to Marx's First International, we have the answer to this, or that if we read Glissant as closely as I tried, relation is the magic bullet. But I am taken by thinkers, traditions of thought, and political practices, experiments. The sit-in might be one of them. De Pest is another one that give us resources for the difficult conundrum that you are talking about. And all we can do is think, not apply that stuff, not take their answers for our answers, but to dwell in that space conceptually, interpersonally, and politically, because I think that's the task. Yeah, but please.
Well, maybe I'm misunderstanding.
No doubt.
But
Understanding is a little overrated also. There's productive misunderstanding and mistranslation.
according to Rachel, but I guess. Well, it's an interesting thing. It's like, for me, that question of where does it hurt, it's just been very material for me, particularly over the last 3 months, because I couldn't walk, you know. The first time I've been out of my house to do something like this in 3 months. And my feet hurt, you know. I can barely, I can't, you know. So there's no reason, I would not be here.
Clearly.
If I didn't think that that's what you were doing. Like what I said that seemed to roll so easily from, if it seemed to roll so easily from my tongue, it's in part because I had read your book. So I'm not, we don't really, we ain't got no argument.
No.
You know, it's like
My last point was not agonistic at all. It was just like, yes, yes, yes. Exclamation, exclamation, exclamation.
But it, well, yeah, like I said, maybe I was just misunderstanding. I just feel like, but we do have differences. So for instance, but again, it's no point in, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. I will say this, I mean, I thought that what we were trying to do in the undercommons, I think Stefano would say this too, is pretty much the same thing as what I thought you were trying to do in Concrete Utopianism. And to the extent that we feel misunderstood about that book, it's because when most people say the undercommons, what they really mean is the university and the undercommons. It's just one chapter.
Yeah.
And if we had to do over again, we wouldn't put that chapter in. But this thing of, yeah, there are histories, there are flashes and moments of these that in which the thing that we say, that we characterize, that we rightly name as an impossible possibility, it happens. It happens all the time. It keeps happening. It's ubiquitous, actually. It's how we manage to still be breathing. And so really it's a question of a kind of, again, an empirical imagination. It's one thing to try to imagine what doesn't exist. And it's a whole other thing. And it seems like it might be a little bit harder to try to imagine what does. And so that to me is a really important aspect of the book. And then at the same time, to imagine these things that have existed, to see how they have worked, to see that what it is that we want has already been, you know, and is already on some level. It doesn't negate this question of is it still happening again? the boomerang. So at the very moment at which we celebrate the ubiquity of what it is that we actually want, at the very moment that we celebrate the amazingly beautiful temporal anomaly of anticipation, like Professor Thomas was describing, we still, at that moment, we still are responsible for paying attention to the boomerang.
Yeah.
That's the, and then it's, okay, where does the boomerang, how does it happen? Where does it work? You know, what if it works in these terms that we use, that we appeal to? Like the interpersonal, right? That's the, you know, and that's, and you know, I feel like we have a responsibility to try to ask those questions. And at the same time, we have a responsibility to try to make it not hurt when we ask those questions. We try to make it feel good, right?
I hear you to be saying something similar also about incommensurability, like just the not, we don't have to be caught there, but
I think
try to make it.
that was a great way to end. I thought maybe that was a great place to end. I think. Yeah. Thank you. All right. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you. Amazing conversation. Thank you, guys. Amazing. We're just, I know you're in pain. We're all hot, but I'm charged up. We can keep going and going and going because that. So, I mean, you, as a poet does, you ended with an opening. How to, you beg that, you know, that could have been the first line. How to
It's a matter of
keep
scale.
asking those questions, but in a way that doesn't